Okay, we should be live. Welcome everybody. Welcome, Emilie. Bonjour.
Thank you.
Hola.
Bonjour. Hola.
How are you this morning?
Doing fine. How are you, Alice?
Good, thank you.
Good.
So welcome to everybody that is watching live or coming back to watch the recording. My name is Alice Gralty. I work here at Mikasa, where we introduce and reinforce Spanish via music and movement for families with babies. I'm really excited about this conversation with Emilie. She has languages coming out of her ears, and I love talking about languages. Before we went live, Emilie and I were talking about how we've actually never met each other in person. So I'm going to give just a little bit of background about what my language journey has been. I came to Mi Casa es Tu Casa as the mom of a 2-year-old and was looking for as much Spanish immersion opportunities as I could get for her. I have been speaking Spanish to her since she was born. I learned Spanish traveling and studying abroad. I did my senior year of high school in Spain. And then actually, as soon as I got back from that year in high school, the first thing I did was enroll in French classes at Austin Community College. So before going off to the University of Massachusetts, I had 3 semesters of French under my belt, and then in college continued studying both French and Spanish. And I was an au pair in Brussels for 2 adorable little French-speaking boys. And then my daughter's preschool, where she started when she was about 2, actually ended up being both French and Spanish immersion, Los Amiguitos. And they did 2 days of French and 3 days of Spanish. And I wasn't really thinking about adding French and was like a little bit concerned because I've always been so protective of Spanish because I know that, you know, the community language is English and Spanish could go away if I'm not careful to protect it. I've always kind of thought that way. But then introducing, I mean, she did great. She did fine and learned a lot of French and has promptly forgotten it. She's now 6 years old and in first grade at a dual language school in AISD. But I think that having that French exposure, it's in there. And so I'm someone that, like, we've mostly had a bilingual journey, but I think we've had the potential to have more of a multilingual journey also if I had or if I did emphasize French also. But that's me. I'm going to give your introduction.
Sure.
And we'll kind of launch in. So, Emilie, and thank you again for being here. Emilie's the mother of a multilingual 4-year-old. What is his name, by the way?
Mistral.
Mistral, who she lovingly describes as beautiful, curious, funny, and extraordinary. I think he's home with you today, right?
Yes.
And if he pops in at any point, that's okay too.
All right. Thank you.
Emilie has over 15 years of experience teaching languages and linguistics at the university level. She has her PhD in Arabic linguistics and wrote a Duolingo Arabic course that's used by millions around the world. She is not just a polyglot, but a hyperpolyglot with good proficiency in French, English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, and Arabic, plus more languages with a lower proficiency. For me, it's really exciting just to be able to interview somebody who has studied and lived and breathed and thought about languages so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything that I left out or anything that you want to say?
No, I will actually. One thing I will say is, well, thank you for this introduction, and I loved hearing your story. It's really cool. Now I have a lot of follow-up questions, but
Great.
we'll do that later, not necessarily within the framework of this interview. But one thing I will say is I feel like, I do have a PhD in Arabic linguistics, and, I got my undergrad in linguistics, master's degree, linguistics, PhD as well. My emphasis in my studies has not been or was not child language acquisition at all.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even really, applied linguistics, teaching language, even though that came with the package. It was a huge part of my training, and I do consider myself a very passionate teacher. So I've thought a lot about teaching and what works best, and I like reading books about it. But with that said, I think my main qualification as being here today is really just my personal interests in myself being a hyperpolyglot and raising a child who's multilingual. So I'll be relying a lot on my experience, my personal experience, more so than my degrees probably. Even though, I've learned a thing or two, certainly through my training, my professional training.
Yeah, that makes sense. So while we're here, I sort of was doing some thinking about, why are we having this conversation in the frame of Mikasa's Tu Casa? And I think here in Texas, while bilingualism is pretty commonplace, multilingualism is a little more rare, especially compared to other countries. And it can even sometimes garner funny looks or concerns from other people. Like, you speak how many? I'm sure you have plenty of stories, but also in the context of exposing your children to so many languages. So I wanted to kind of demystify and explore the question of how many languages is too many, or is that even a thing? And we actually sometimes even get parents who they're interested in our class, but they'll say, I don't think my child is old enough yet for this class or to learn a new language. And we're back there thinking, you should have started 6 months ago. And so some parents wonder, shouldn't a child master one language before moving on to another? Won't learning 3 or 4 languages at once confuse them or even cause delays? While still others, and certainly in the context of Mikasa's Tu Casa, they're already doing the bilingual thing, and they are wondering, how do I add a 3rd language? I would like to, and so how do I do that? What are some techniques? So that's kind of the context for the interview itself. And my first question does kind of have to do with when we start learning a language. Like I mentioned, at Mikasa's Tu Casa, we focus on the earlier the better. Children are wired to learn languages. We know that early exposure is important for forming and solidifying all those billions of neural synapses, for allowing them to hear the sounds from different languages early on. But you were raised in a monolingual French-speaking household, and didn't become interested in languages until, I think you said middle school or around there. So how did you become interested in languages? What language did you start with? And how do you think you have fared having started your language learning process like a little bit later?
A little later in life. Yeah, I really like that question. So yes, monolingual, French-speaking household. I wasn't even really familiar with the concept of foreign languages until my older brother, who's 6 years older, started middle school. So in France, at least at the time, you didn't start studying a foreign language until 6th grade. And so my brother went to 6th grade. That would have made me, maybe a 6-year-old or something like that, maybe a tiny bit younger. And he started learning English. And so he would come home and say, oh, I learned this new word in English. And I was like, what's English? He's like, well, it's this language. And I'm like, okay. So in English, this is how you talk. And I'm like, oh, that sounds funny. So, okay, so like, am I speaking English right now? And I would just make up a nonsensical, just cluster of random sounds and sort of like and he'd say, no, that's not English. That doesn't make sense. It's just a bunch of sounds. And I'm like, what's the difference? I just had no concept of the fact that there were sound systems and phonological systems, and that languages did things in a pretty systematic way. And that if you didn't stick to those sounds and rules, then you weren't making any sense. Like that was something that was beyond the scope of what I could comprehend as a small child. So that's how I think innocent I was, or naive, or however we frame it. I think anyway, so that's where I started, but it also got me excited. I was really curious about this thing. Like, what does that mean? And when is it a word and when is it not a word? And so when I got to 6th grade, I was really excited to learn English. I had a teacher that I really clicked with, that my brother had years before. And the way he taught us worked for me. We had to draw pictures to help us remember a word. So for every new word, we had a binder where we had to draw something. And that worked well for me. It was this visual creation of mine. And I got to do whatever I wanted. That's how I started. And you know, it was a very traditional, besides that, the binder with the pictures, it was a very traditional sort of approach to language teaching. I did 2 years of English. Then in 8th grade, I started my second foreign language, which I picked German. The most popular one where I'm from was Spanish, but I picked then Italian, probably equal with German at the time. But I picked German because my brother had done that. And I also started in 8th grade the dead languages. So I started Latin and ancient Greek.
So is that common for like 6th grade, you start one language, and then in 8th grade, you have the option to start another one in school?
Yes, it's pretty common. And certainly when I was in middle school, like that would have been, like I started middle school, I think in 89. But that in the early 90s, that was the system. You had to start one foreign language in 6th grade and then a second foreign language in 8th grade. And some schools offered different languages. Some schools, a school that my friend went to offered Russian, for instance. But as a first language at the time, you had to have English. You didn't have a choice in that as a first foreign language. And then as a second foreign language, you could choose between what your school offered. Spanish, German tended to be offered everywhere. Italian was up there as well. And then some other languages were more uncommon. Anyway, so that's what I did, and I ended up sticking to that. I didn't have to do Latin and Greek, but I chose to because my brother did it.
He had a big influence on you.
So then I got to high school, and I ended up choosing. We had to choose an emphasis, sort of like major. My emphasis was science, and biology was my sub-emphasis. And so I didn't have to do all those foreign languages, but I chose to. So I chose to stick with, I had to do English till I graduated high school, but I chose to stick with German and with Latin. And then I did 1 year of Greek in high school and then dropped it the last 2 years of high school. But I did it because I enjoyed it. And honestly, like even German, sometimes I feel like, why did I even do it? A couple of my high school years were a little bit of a waste. I didn't like the teachers. I didn't get, particularly good grades. And I took Italian as well. 1 year of Italian in high school, and that was awesome. Like I really clicked with Italian.
Did you click with the teacher too? I feel like there has to be like a human connection.
Yes, a human connection to that. But anyway, whatever. After I left high school, I didn't know. I wanted to go into medical school, then acting. I didn't really know what was going on. But yeah, so that's when I started. But then at the age of 19, I decided, I really want to learn English properly, speak it properly, and I feel pretty comfortable for somebody who's never really traveled anywhere English speaking. So I chose a college in the United States. And ended up getting a scholarship and moving to the States at that point. So that was 23 years ago. I moved to the US, and that's when I really learned English. My first year was trial and error. It was hard for me to have a social group. My best friend was French because I really didn't feel that comfortable speaking English, especially outside of books and things that I had been trained to do. I didn't really understand people's accent. There was a lot of slang and sort of, pragmatic stuff that was, I just didn't understand. But then past the first year, and the culture shock as well was hard. But past that first year, I started doing really well in English, decided to major in linguistics, and just went fully into it. Yeah, lived in foreign language housing during several years of my undergrad. And yeah, and then later, like my last year, my senior year, decided to do Arabic as part of my linguistics degree. So I actually didn't start. I took a break, lived in Greece and Cyprus for a little bit, came back. So I didn't start studying Arabic until my mid-20s.
Okay.
Which was really kind of, past the critical period.
Right. I think that gives a lot of us adults hope that we can learn more languages.
Exactly. But, it's interesting because I've had really good success. Your question is like, how have I fared? So I've been really lucky in a lot of ways. But I've fared really well in the languages that I've learned. My English is all right. I get by. I do fine. I feel comfortable. I felt comfortable writing, my PhD dissertation in English. It's not a problem at this point. I am married to a native English speaker, which has helped as well. But even my Arabic that I started in my mid-20s, I did invest a lot of time and effort, a lot of time on task, a lot of focused study time, good opportunities to live in Arabic-speaking communities. I got to study Arabic at the advanced/superior level at the University of Damascus for a year in Syria before the events, and have lived several months in Jordan a couple of times. Got to visit and work in Egypt 3 different times. So I've been really lucky in terms of my opportunities. I've also sought out those opportunities, and I've been lucky with scholarships and things that have supported me along the way. I also do think that, I'm not going to say like, if you put your mind to it, you can do it. Like, I don't want to paint a picture where if you've tried as an adult and failed, then it was on you. Like, look at me, I did it. That's not at all my message. I think we're all, nature and nurture. I think learning languages is also something I naturally do with a fair amount of ease and comfort. And so that's been a big part of it. But I will say, encouraging words, I have taught adults at the college level. I've had adults in their 40s, 50s be my students sometimes in beginner, intermediate, advanced Arabic classes. And some of them have done really well and been able to learn Arabic to a good degree of proficiency that allows them to have conversations with people and feel good about it. So there is definitely hope. I would say that the critical period is real, but a lot of the time, even if you're past that critical period, you can still put in the effort, and it's probably worth it.
Yeah, thank you. That does give us hope, and I hear a theme too, and I see it with myself also. You need either great motivation or human connection to learn a language. The reason I started French right away when I came back was because I had spent 2 weeks in France with my Spanish friend, with his family, and I didn't speak any French at all. And I just remember kind of like devouring French more than I had Spanish, because I had all these memories of like, oh, I might need this. I might know how to say this. And I'm going to want to know how to say that, like when I go back. So that motivation. And
I love what you're saying. I think one theme that comes up for me when people ask me, like, how do I encourage my child, my child, we used to speak 2 languages together, but now they're at an age where they don't want me speaking that other language to them, and they get upset when I do, or they won't respond well if I ask them to respond in the or other language. And I think one main the theme that comes up for me is that concept of need. I think if you create a need for the child to speak the language, then it's not the only way, certainly, and it's not it's not, if you don't have a need, then they won't learn the language, but it's a pretty powerful one if there is a need to communicate. If you have friends or family that the child really loves that only speaks that other language, it makes it easier to motivate the child to learn it, because now they have to use that language in order to get that connection, that thing that they need and want so badly.
I think the teachers at Mi Casa es Tu Casa play a huge role in that for a lot of kids. I know for my child, they do, because she loves the teachers there so much. She has never tried to speak to them in English. And they've stayed a huge motivator for her in Spanish.
That's true. And and one thing I did mention is I started, and maybe I'll circle back to this at some other point in the interview, but I also want to say, like, Mi Casa es Tu Casa has been, like, it was such an important piece of our multilingual journey. And I
hear that.
Yeah, it was so helpful for me to have that resource, and it even helped me sort of strategize on how to use that as an extra motivator for me to maintain Spanish. That's part of my child's language scape.
So let's talk about your child's language scape. So I'm guessing you speak French to him at home.
Yes.
And then which languages does he speak, and how do you support them either in the home or outside of the home?
Thank you for that plan? So I will start by saying, and this is, I think, also something I will probably come back to maybe, but I will start by saying I had one plan before he was born. And I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to do that. It wasn't like such an intricate plan that it was impossible to reach. But I did have one sort of vision for his proficiency and what languages. And I've adapted it to the realities of life. And so that's my main, my starting point is for people listening here who hope to raise a bilingual or multilingual child and who don't have a plan that they feel is, final. I will say it's okay for the plan to change. And the most important thing always is our children's needs and our personal circumstances. So it's okay to adapt and say, oh, I'm going to try this, and then realize maybe this doesn't quite work, or maybe the goals that I had are not going to be as easily achievable as I had hoped, and therefore I'm going to adapt and do something that makes our life more comfortable, less anxious, less stressful, and that's perfectly okay. That's not a form of giving in or selling out. That's a form of being human and being, I think, emotionally mature enough to recognize what our priorities are. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So my child's multilingualism, 4 languages are in his language scape, mainly French, English, Spanish, and Arabic, in that order of priority. So French is the language that we speak at home. And it was interesting, my husband is a native English speaker. His dad, his grandparents were from Monterrey, Mexico.
Oh, okay.
And so on one side, and then his other grandparents are from Scotland, from Dundee, where his mother was born and raised. But so they, his mother is an English speaker. And so he learned Spanish later in life. He lived in Spain for 2 years, and that's how he learned Spanish. He didn't learn it from his dad. It was his dad's first language. But he had a really traumatic childhood. His dad did. So my father-in-law, because Spanish was his first language, growing up in the 50s in El Paso, was beat for using English in school. And he said, I never want this for my kids. Therefore, I will never speak Spanish to my kids.
There's a whole generation that's true for in Texas, for sure.
Exactly. And I think it goes, and in the history of languages, this is, I would say, the norm. This has been the norm in a lot of in a lot of different countries and cultures. If you don't speak the language of the culturally and economically dominant group, you might be punished for it very seriously. I mean, I think of the Basques under Franco.
In Spain, yeah.
I mean, there's tons of, and even the substrate language, the language that my great-grandparents spoke, Provençal, was essentially erased off of the map of that French languages spoken in French, minority languages in France. In the late 1900s, about 90% of the people in my region of Provence were native Provençal speakers. And 100 years later, that number was nothing. I mean, and at this point, all the speakers are basically dead. I mean, it's almost extinct. So all that to say, sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent. All that to say, my husband has Spanish as part of his heritage, and he learned it as an adult, not from his father, for all those reasons that I think are interesting and relatable for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then he also learned French, but after we got married.
Okay.
But he's a really good language learner and a really gifted one, and he's curious. And when our baby was born, I thought we'd do OPO. I thought we'd do one parent language, I'll speak French, and my husband can speak. I wanted him to speak Spanish, but he told me, English is my native language, and that's the language of love for me, and that's what I would give my child. And I said, perfect, that sounds great. But when he was born, when Nicole was born, my husband naturally started speaking French to him. That's the language that came up. And so he's never spoken anything but French to our child.
Wow, that's incredible.
I know, it's crazy. So our home is French speaking. Every time we address Mistral, both myself and my husband speak French to him. Then together we speak quite a bit of English and sometimes some other languages. My husband also speaks some Arabic, so it's fun. We play around with languages a lot. For Spanish, I started speaking Spanish to him one day a week since birth. And so this is, people do it differently, but this is how I chose to do it. And when my child was 7 months, I believe, I discovered mikasa tu casa, and I met Laura, and I was like, I need this in my life. And so I signed up for classes, and I was so happy, so happy with the experience I had. And that became, so basically, mikasa tu casa became my structure around which I would sort of frame my Spanish practice with my child.
Okay.
And so even though he was only 7 months old, say that we had classes with Laura every Thursday. Well, Thursday morning I would wake him up, or he would wake up, and I would start speaking Spanish to him. And
I was going to ask which day of the week was Spanish and why you chose that day, but now I know.
It's whatever day we had the class on. And I would sometimes forget and then be like, oh, we're getting ready to go to our Spanish class. And so then I would switch and I would say, here we are. I'm going to get you ready, baby. We're going to get dressed and we're going to go see Laura. We're going to sing songs. It'll be so fun. At the time, Laura was the only teacher. So if you're, the other mikasa tu casa teachers are also incredible. But this is why I'm bringing up Laura so much. And so then we would do that, and he would play in Spanish, and I would try to maintain it at least half the day if I could, up till the whole day. Sometimes I did it the whole day. And there was some flexibility, if I slipped back into French, like I never stressed out about it. And so by the time he became verbal, he could understand Spanish really well. And then when he was 2 years old, he started a Spanish immersion Montessori preschool in Austin, and he was with them for almost an entire school year before the pandemic. And then I had to take him out. And during the pandemic, we maintained. So his Spanish was in a good place. By the time he was almost 3, was in a really good place. So his Spanish was much stronger. He didn't speak English. So this was a concern to some people around me.
But not you.
Not me. Not me at all. People would tell me, well, it's problematic because when I talked, like the problem with the situation, I'm like, okay, it's a problem, I suppose, is that your child doesn't understand English. So like I can't communicate with him. And I'm like, well, my child actually happens to be a very early speaker, and he speaks 2 languages. Most children at 2.5 to 3 years old are not necessarily that verbal yet. This is not a problem. the fact that he's not able to speak in English to you is not a problem. It will come. It's
I
so
want
cool.
to, yeah, I want to push you a little bit on that point, just because we did get a question about pretty much that from a mother. We talked about it a little bit earlier, who she's wondering, is it okay that I am speaking only Spanish to my child at home? This is from Olga, who's a mikasa tu casa mom. She says, I've been only speaking Spanish to my daughter at home because I know that eventually when she goes to daycare or school, she'll learn English. Am I putting her at a disadvantage? Probably thinking to herself, when she gets to school, the first day of school, she's not going to know her letters or her numbers in English. She says, I'm trying to encourage her to speak good Spanish and to not lose it.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says, I've seen examples of that in my family. And I think what she means is examples of probably Spanish deteriorating, like maybe turning into a little more Spanglish.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say it's healthy enough to just kind of in the beginning ignore the community language?
In my experience, it is. And I understand Olga's concern.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it resonates in all of us, right? You question yourself even when you believe in a principle, or when you have a vision for what you're accomplishing and things are going well, you will still have that doubt in the back of your mind of am I doing enough? How badly am I screwing up my child?
Right, on anything, languages aside.
This is going to be one more thing for them to complain to their therapist about when they're in their 20s or 30s. And I would say, in my experience, the child will eventually integrate the community.
Mm-hmm.
And the community language, whether we like it or not, will most likely become the child's dominant language sooner or later.
Yeah.
And so these are the golden years. These are times when, especially if Olga, you have the opportunity to spend a lot of time with your child at home. This is absolutely, for me, appropriate. And the community language can come a little bit later, and it will. So my child didn't speak English. He didn't. He knew like basic things. He would say hi, like he knew. But see, it's interesting because kids are very sensitive to contexts and things and are very smart. And so he knew which language to speak to different people.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So when we were at the grocery store, and because he was a very friendly little toddler, he would say, hi. He knew not to say, bonjour, hola. He knew that most likely wasn't the language that would be sociolinguistically appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And so context mattered to him.
Yeah.
So that's what we did for Spanish. And during the pandemic, I ended up actually moving in with my in-laws in Utah. We were in the mountains during the pandemic. My husband was still here in Texas. But so he started learning English at that point because he was spending a lot of time with his grandma. And so he's funny because he has a tiny bit of a Scottish accent when he speaks English. It's really cute. But now he's doing great. I mean, it's been, a little bit over a year. It was last June. So we were there for about a year with them. And you wouldn't believe how good his English is. I mean,
English is,
effortless, He just integrates it like no big deal. He'll be like, oh, what's this word? What does that mean? Oh, okay. And then you'll use it in the following sentence.
Yeah.
And then Arabic, I had plans for him to speak Arabic. I had plans for me to do something like what I did with Spanish, but in Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
During the pandemic, I maintained tutoring sessions for him 4 times a week where he spoke Spanish with someone online for 40 minutes that he knew.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so it's not gone. Like his Spanish is not entirely gone. It's still there, but it's not one that he prefers to speak these days, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it's all connected to need and socialization.
Yeah.
But with Arabic, I had a plan. And so I tried to like sort of like make a huge effort to create a community where I could have play dates with Arabic speakers, where he could engage in Arabic with other kids. But honestly, it didn't really work out. And I ended up putting Arabic, like understanding that within my current circumstances, maybe that wasn't going to happen immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So my approach with Arabic has been pretty much just exposure, exposing him to a little bit of context-appropriate Arabic, a little bit like a
hearing
few
it.
times in the week. So, for instance, if we cook together, which I cook, so he cooks with me almost every day. If we cook a meal that is typically a meal served in an area where Arabic is spoken, then we will speak Arabic while we cook. And he knows all the names of the ingredients. His favorite restaurant is Dimassi's. It's a Mediterranean buffet, and they serve Arab food. I would say like Lebanese food. They have a north location and a south location. But so every time we go to Dimassi's, he knows that we're going to be speaking Arabic. And he'll tell, I'll ask him, like, شو بدك? Like, what do you want? Like, بدي حمص, بدي سمك. I want hummus, I want fish. شو بدك تشرب? شو بتشرب? What do you want to drink? And he'll tell me, rose water. Tamar Hindi. He knows Tamar Hindi, tamarind. And he will tell me all the halawiyat, all the desserts, all the fruit. And so he knows quite a bit of Arabic. He knows how to count. He knows the numbers in Arabic. He recognizes them and can put them in order. He knows that Arabic is written right to left. He knows the letter that his name starts with. He knows where it's spoken, and he can identify specific friends whose language is Arabic. And so he'll watch songs and cartoons in Arabic and ask me questions like, like he'll ask me in French, but integrate some words like, where's the cat? Some words in Arabic. And that's, for me, he can produce the sounds. When he does certain things or he gets really happy or someone asks him like, kifak, how are you? Marhaba kifak. He will say, alhamdulillah. Like he knows how to do the ha sound. He knows how to do the ra sound. And for me, that's my expectation at this point. And I feel like, you're years ahead of where I was when I was your age.
Right.
And look where I've come, And so for me, I will say, even just exposing children to sounds of languages, even languages we don't know, suggesting like, oh, you're going to watch cartoons. Like, oh, today they only have it in Spanish and German. Sorry. Which language do you want? And he does, like, he'll tell me all the time. He's like, oh, this one, Masha and the bear. He'll be like, oh, I know that one is in Siberia. I know that one is taking place in Russia. So let's do Russian today. I'm like, okay. Into it in Russian. Or like when Luca came out, the Disney cartoon, we told him, this is taking place in Cinque Terre. That's in Italy. And
we should probably watch it in Italian.
And he was like, great. And he watched the whole show in Italian. And when I speak Italian, he'll say, that's Italian. You're speaking Italian right now. And I'm like, yes. So I think the best thing to come out of exposure to languages, I would say two things. One of the best two things for me is just he's totally fearless. Like multilingualism for him is the way the world works. He thinks I speak them all. That's the only thing where I'm like, no. Do you speak Polish? I'm like, no, I don't speak. How do you say this in German? How do you say this in Mandarin? And I'm like, I don't speak Mandarin. I can't help you there. But for him, it's like, okay, there's languages. People speak in these languages. They communicate with their loved ones in those languages. They perform everyday tasks in those languages. And there's tons and tons and tons of different ones. And I can listen to them and enjoy the sounds and imitate the sounds and ask questions like, what's this word? What's that word? And it's like a game. And it's okay if I don't have a sense of what's being said. That's just the way the world works. And I love that. That's it's a big piece of who he is. And I would say the second good thing, best thing about exposing children to multiple languages, even if we don't speak those languages ourselves, is the cultural connection. And I know
you gave many good examples of you're eating this kind of food, so let's speak that language. And the movie is set in Italy, so let's watch it in Italian. And
thank you.
And certain, like you said, friends that you have that speak those languages, we speak that language to those friends that are from
exactly. There. And what expressions are appropriate in this context? How do we? Things that are as basic as turn taking. When we're speaking with these friends in this language, what does a conversation look like?
Mm-hmm.
When do I speak? When do they speak? You know, that's all part of what I think children who are exposed to multilingualism learn, and it's very, very valuable.
And I think it ripples out to other, you know, cultural sensitivities, and just being understanding that people do things differently, people speak differently, people look differently. And it's reminding me of you talking about yourself as a child and not even understanding the concept that there could be another way of talking. And in that regard, your son is way further ahead than you were.
Way further, exactly.
I will say that we keep getting questions from YouTube, so let me see if we can. There's one which is pretty relevant, especially to this family dynamic, and one that comes up. It's certainly come up for me. I'm super jealous that your husband, who learned French, is also able to only speak French to your son. My husband has a really good basic understanding of Spanish, and so I don't ever feel like I'm cutting him out when I'm speaking to my daughter, and that's been huge. But there are families where the other partner doesn't speak the language that, you know, if it's the mother, for example, doesn't speak the language. And so how do you deal? Let's see the way Kimberly puts it. She says, what's your approach to the isolation a spouse may feel when you are able to communicate in a language with your child that they don't understand?
Okay, this is such a good question. Hi, Kimberly. I will say that I don't actually feel qualified to address this question because this is not my reality. And it sounds like maybe, I understand, Alice, you just mentioned that your husband does, you know, he has some knowledge of Spanish, but I would like to hear what you think.
Yeah. And I'm actually pregnant, so I'm having a baby in December. And we've already talked about the fact that for the first year, we will all speak Spanish to the baby. You know, his level of Spanish for the first year of a child's life is there, and he's on board, and I feel so lucky. But I feel like it kind of comes back to what you were saying with, you know, you may have a plan, and then you may need to adjust that plan because languages are so emotional. Like, I know when I was thinking about maybe speaking Spanish to my daughter, I didn't make that commitment. I didn't tell anybody that I was going to do it for sure. I just wanted to wait and see her when she arrived and hold her, and then decide whether it felt right to speak a language that's not my mother tongue, my native language, to my daughter. And it was weird at first to speak Spanish to her. But after a while, Spanish became my kind of like my language that I speak with children. Like, I'll see other people's babies and I want to speak Spanish to them. And my point there is just that it is so emotional, and you have to take everyone's emotions into consideration. Yeah. I know with my mother, she also, and with my husband, like, they both got to the point where their level, you know, my daughter's level of Spanish surpassed theirs. And with my mom, because she's super pro bilingualism and her granddaughter speaking Spanish, she almost put too much pressure on herself. There came a point where I could see, because we lived with my mom for a while, for about half a year, and I could see my mom sometimes wanting to say something, not being able to formulate it quickly enough. The moment passed and then she wouldn't say anything. And so at a certain point, we talked and I was like, Mom, just speak English. Like, if it, you know, let it come. And she's still, you know, they speak Spanish to each other when they can, and we'll do activities in Spanish. But
yeah, thanks for sharing all that. You're right that it's a very emotional experience, and I really like what you said about everyone's emotions needing to be part of the equation. And so perhaps what it looks like, I'm not sure exactly what the right solution would be, and I think it will probably be different from family to family always. But what comes to mind for me is possibly, you know, having an open discussion as a family about what we would like to achieve and what frustrations exist and feelings of isolation, and coming up with some kind of perhaps compromise on, perhaps we say, instead of me speaking in Spanish to my child 100% of the time, I find a different setup, right? So if I spend some time alone with the children when my spouse isn't around, then maybe I limit speaking Spanish to those moments when I'm alone with them, but when we're all together as a family, we speak English. Or maybe if that's not really a good setup or not really an option for us, then we choose certain days of the week, or we say, on those days we're going to be enforcing Spanish, and I'm going to be speaking Spanish with the kids, but on these other days, we're going to be speaking English. Or maybe each day that we speak Spanish, we begin with an activity where the spouse can also be exposed to and integrate words in Spanish or phrases in Spanish. And we can turn this into a game where, depending on the age of the children, something age appropriate. But I know things that work really well with, like, my 4-year-old is naming body parts, or saying, playing like, yo veo, like, I what is it? I spy. And we talk about different items around the house and point to them and touch them, look at them and say the word in Spanish. And that's a game that, again, body parts, like pointing to, show me your whatever, your boca, donde está la boca, where's your mouth? And so, this is a possible way of compromising. But at the end of the day, yeah, we do want everybody to feel integrated and equally as important in the family dynamic.
I think you're right too, having the conversation with the parent that isn't understanding the other language and understanding what the fears are. And maybe there are ways that you can address what they're afraid that they'll miss out on, or and you mentioned games too. There might be other ways that parent can join in on the other language and do a tiny bit of learning. And like, my husband will read, books in Spanish to my daughter. He was doing one last night because, like, that was the book she wanted to read.
Cool.
And I kind of hear him afterwards saying, he was like, yeah, well, if I had had time to read it beforehand and practice, it would have come out better. She may have had some critiques for him. I don't know.
Sure. I love that. Yeah. I think those are all possible solutions, I suppose. But yeah, at the end of the day, the point of all this, I think what we all need and seek as humans, when we boil it down to its essence, is love and connection.
Yeah.
And if we're able to create that, I think multilingualism is a way for many people to get that. It's important for me that my child is able to speak to my parents who don't speak anything but French. So it's important to me that my child learn Spanish because he has distant relatives in Mexico, and because it's part of his heritage, and because his last name is one that people will recognize as being associated with Spanish culture. It's actually Basque. Zuniga is actually, it's actually a Basque last name. It's Zuniga. Apparently, I don't speak Basque, but yeah, it was integrated into Spanish a long time ago. And then it's important to me that my child has a sense of what Arabic is and sounds like, because I've dedicated almost 20 years of my life to learning it and teaching it. And I have dear friends who speak Arabic. But it's that connection that I'm seeking. And so making sure that everybody in the family feels connected.
Yeah, and understands each other's motivation.
Language use.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. There are a few more questions that we could take a stab at.
We could do perhaps one more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think one of the bigger questions that we tend to get is, if I don't really speak the language, how do I integrate a third or a second language into my child's life? I don't know if you have any insight on that.
I have some thoughts on that. I will say that if okay, say that I don't speak this language. I don't speak Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And I would really like my child to learn some. It's important to me for X, Y, and Z reasons. And my first instinct as a mother and a language lover would be to look for structures that are already in place
Mm-hmm.
that would allow my child to have exposure to that language and to engage in the language without me having to make much of an effort. Because that, something that's ready to go and that you just plug into your life. So, I would do some research in local resources. Are there local playdates that are Russian speaking? Is there a Russian speaking community in Austin that I could join for things like family outings, cultural activities, whatever it may be? Um, uh, if nothing in Austin, then what can I find online? Perhaps in the United States or in a time zone that corresponds with mine, live events, things that we could do. I would look into the schedule of the Austin Public Library. That's one thing I would do a lot with Mandarin. When Mistral was really young and before the pandemic, I would join all the bilingual story times I could find, or monolingual, like Spanish story time.
No matter what language it was.
No matter what language it was, I would just go because
Mm-hmm.
I knew that any exposure is good. So I would look at that. I would look at, um, perhaps NGOs. That's where I would start. Then, if that doesn't exist, I would basically look at my budget and I would say, how much am I able to invest in this? What's reasonable for our family and our
Mm-hmm.
circumstances? And if I have a budget for this, then I would look online for programs that I have to pay for.
Mm-hmm.
Whether depending on the child's age, then perhaps some form of tutoring or engaging with children in a framework that's a little bit more structured and that I pay for. If I have a good budget, then I would say I would honestly look at schools in Russian-speaking areas of the world and say, do these guys have an online program that works with the time difference? Or could we perhaps plan a trip? Now, this again takes a certain degree of means, and it's okay if some of us are not there. But saying, okay, like what options do I have to perhaps take my child there for a 2-week immersion, or meeting up with those families that I'm meeting online? What would that look like? Maybe not next summer, maybe not in 2 years, but perhaps in a few years from now. So there's ways that I can do that. I would also go into free resources like Russian audio on Netflix. Like honestly, that's one I do all the time. And like I don't speak Russian, but in context, especially because you have the option of putting subtitles on in whatever language you want, English included. I've learned a few things. I've learned like spasibo, thank you, and I've learned что, like meaning what in Russian. So you pick up little things by using tools that you're already paying for. And then beyond that, I would say, if something will stick, probably out of all of those, something will stick. And if you're worried that, oh, it's useless, I'm wasting my time, I will say, in my view and in my experience, one of the best gifts we can give our kids and ourselves is learning a thing or two about our own positioning, cultural positioning on different values, societal values. Where do I fall on that spectrum of views and sort of positions, moral issues, political issues, whatever it may be, etiquette, table etiquette, whatever. How do I greet people? How do I behave when I'm at someone's house? What gift do I bring? All those things. Where do I fall? And where might other people fall? And this is something you can very much learn about a target culture, a culture that you're interested in that speaks a different language, that without speaking the language. If you're able to make friends that are native speakers or excuse me, native members of the cultural community that you're interested in, you will be able to discover a whole lot of stuff through just talking to them, through just listening to their stories, to just listening to the way they express themselves and talk, the things they highlight, how they react to social situations. So I think a lot of just observing, and children are really good, especially during the socialization phase, which lasts for years, Children are sponges. They're really good at integrating those things and internalizing them without even thinking about it, without ever thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so like having that community, even if it turns out that it's an English speaking community, but it is culturally diverse, will automatically make our kids better world citizens and more able to sort of navigate different cultural spaces with more ease than, say, people in my generation or my parents' generation.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, always worth it. But I'm interested. You might have.
I love that. I love the thought that also, you know, if you don't have all the linguistic skills, but you have access to the culture, whether it's movies or books, or even talking to people in English who are from, you know, say Russia, if that's our target language, how that can even get you closer to learning the language. I love that idea. I think also one of the things that I've learned from this interview is that it's okay not to go all in. I think one reason that I've kind of kept French very much on the sideline is I'm used to going all in. Like if we're going to do Spanish, we're going to do Spanish. And I don't know how to fit that. I don't know how to fit French into that. But just hearing you talk about any level of exposure is progress towards that language and that culture. And
I really believe that. And parallel to this, keeping a realistic mind with what we're trying to accomplish. If you know, I'm a strong believer in everything you just restated, basically. And at the same time, I'm also going back to that question of how many languages is too many. I would say our days are made up of 24 hours. Time is a limited resource. And at the end of the day, we only have that time. So whatever we decide to do with languages, if we decide our home is going to be a bilingual, or our family is going to integrate bilingualism or multilingualism, yeah, by focusing time on Russian, then I'm going to be taking time away from Arabic and from French and from Spanish. And that is a compromise, because that's what life is like. Life is constant compromise. Every time we choose something, we're not choosing everything else, right? And so it's something that we have to understand and embrace. If it's not right for us, if our goal is to help our child achieve a certain degree of literacy or proficiency in only Spanish, next to English in 2 languages, which is already such a gift. And we feel like, well, adding this other language is, this is focused time that is precious to me and it's important to me in my connection to my child and my goal, then perhaps that's the way you do it, and it's perfectly acceptable. It's all about our vision, our children's needs, and at the end of the day, the time that we have. And I think there's no wrong way of doing this.
Thank you for coming back to the question. It sounds like the limit of languages is up to each family. Really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Emilie.
You're welcome. What a fun time.
Yeah, it was great. Honestly, I could keep talking for a very long time, but I am pregnant and I will get hungry, so that would cut us short.
Congratulations, Alice.
Thank you.
So exciting.
And for everybody that is watching, we will do a recap of the interview and the questions that we didn't get to. I'll try to address in our blog recap. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. We do interviews like this every once in a while, and also publish music in Spanish, bilingual stories for kids, games, that kind of thing. So come back for everybody else out there watching. And again, thank you so much, Emilie.
You're so welcome. Ahla wa sahla in Arabic. De rien. De nada.
Hasta la próxima. A la prochaine fois.
À la prochaine. Salut. Gracias. Bye.
Bye.